They shut my case before my shoes touched the podium. "Dismissed for lack of evidence," the judge clipped, eyes never rising, while the docket assistant slid my file aside like lint, and the bailiff's hand hovered to keep me in place. Around them, gray suits, polished badges, cologne, and easy laughter floated, and I stood in a thrift store jacket with bust dust on my cuffs, my knuckles cracked from years of work, the smell of lemon cleaner and warm toner in my nose, a wall clock carving the seconds above us. The clerk, bored and certain, wore that small, cruel smile bureaucrats save for people they believe won't fight back. And my name, a whole life, was treated like a typo. But in my weathered folder, beneath the trembling breath I steadied for my grandson, lay a blue circled minute the screens had swallowed. And before that clock takes another lap, I will make the rule they ignored speak aloud and turn this room on its hinges. Before I go on, hit subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. If this speaks to you, share it. Awareness protects our elders. They said my case was closed before I even reached the microphone. Dismissed for lack of evidence. My name came out of the speaker clipped in half, like a ticket torn wrong, and it landed on the room with the soft thud of something already decided. A few people shifted on the wooden benches. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and stale coffee. Above us, a wall clock ticked loud enough to be heard between papers. Each second, a small cut. I stood with my old folder pressed to my chest. The corners had learned the shape of my hands. The cover held the marks of years and bus rides and waiting rooms. Inside, the pages were in the order I rehearsed at the kitchen table, one stack to breathe for the other. On the very top sat the receipt, stamped by the county clerk, ink still deep and clean. There was a time stamped in it that meant everything to me and almost nothing to a scream. The judge didn't look up when he said my name again. A clerk at his elbow flipped through a schedule, then slid it forward like a deck of cards. The microphone on the bench gave a little hiss, as if it had cleared its throat to speak, but thought better of it. When I stepped toward the podium, the bailiff's palm rose, flat and polite. "Not yet. We're moving along." There's a kind of quiet that feels like a door closing in slow motion. I felt it open and close across my shoulders. My case number flickered on the monitor, then vanished into a queue I couldn't see. I glanced down at the folder and counted my steps back to the bench. 1, 2, 3, so I wouldn't leave a piece of myself behind on the floor. The benches were smooth and solemn under a thin coat of dust. My jacket held the cold of the hallway. The clock kept time, and time kept me. I found my grandson in the second row, steady as a lamp. Nathan had a phone in his hands and patience in his face. He had already pulled up the local rules, and the page I needed glowed in faint gray letters. Section 4.2. His eyebrows lifted like a small question. I nodded to say I was all right, even if all right had been downgraded for the moment to standing and breathing and not spilling my papers. The county clerk window sat to one side of the room, glass dull under the lights. Behind it, a young woman wore a lanyard and a faraway look that comes from handling more files than names. The smell of toner drifted up with the warmth from a printer that never sleeps. A red pen rested near her wrist, waiting to underline a day someone would have to revisit. A docket assistant at the front called out a string of cases like stations on a train. Lawyers shuffled forward, jackets rustled, shoes whispered on the tile. I heard the words continued, withdrawn, stipulated, and each word had the weight of a door key to a house I wasn't allowed to enter. When the assistant returned my file to the stack without looking at the front page, I felt something in me lean forward to catch it. The humiliation came not in a shout, but in the way my name slipped past the bench like it had learned to duck. The judge's glasses slid down his nose as he moved on. He spoke quickly, one case, then the next, his tone even and his eyes distant, the rhythm of a man with an afternoon to keep. The microphone breathed and fizzed when he leaned toward it. Each time he said next, it traveled through my ribs. I thought about the steps I'd taken to get here. The bus before sunrise, the metal tray at the security checkpoint where I'd placed my keys, and the copper coin my wife used to rub before hard moments. The guard had lifted the bin with 2 fingers and shoved it down the line without a word. The coin slid under my palm, cool and thin as a whisper. I had tucked it into my pocket and kept walking. When the judge paused to drink from a paper cup, I stood and walked back to the aisle. My knees told me my age and then moved anyway. The bailiff watched me come, his face a calm window. I steadied the folder against my stomach and felt the snap of the clasp against my belt buckle. With my free hand, I smoothed the top edge of the receipt and read the stamp again. The date, the hour, the minute, it was there like a heartbeat. The docket assistant narrowed his eyes at the screen and tapped a key as if my case might materialize with a harder touch. I caught my reflection in the glass of the clerk's window, an old man with work-hewn hands and a jacket a little too thin for rooms like this. My shoes gave off a faint polish smell mixed with dust from the sidewalk. The carpet near the podium had a darker path worn by feet that hoped and waited. Nathan shifted forward 2 inches on the bench. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He angled his phone so that the line I needed from section 4.2 sat large on the screen. It stated what I had learned to lean on. When a filing is timely in the physical record and missing in the system due to a recording error, reconsideration may be requested without delay. My wife would have said the rule is only a lamp if someone plugs it in. I stood at the edge of the podium and listened to the rustle of papers, the slow breath of the air conditioner, the distant buzz of a light that needed changing. The judge returned the cup to the bench. The bailiff's gaze lowered to my folder and lifted again. Not unfriendly, not warm. There was a place on the wood where a nameplate had been moved so often it left a pale halo. I put the folder down in that halo and opened it. The first page was the cover sheet I had typed at home, slow and careful. The second was the receipt from the clerk's counter, stamped in blue with the time that mattered. The third was the local rule, printed from the public terminal and underlined in pencil so lightly I could erase it with my thumb. I had placed them in this order because I believe in the way a story can convince when it is told in the right sequence. Who I am, what I filed, and why the law says the door should be opened again. The docket assistant leaned toward me, eyes on the folder, but hands still. Behind me, Nathan's chair creaked. The woman at the clerk's window looked up, then down, then up again, as though a word she had misheard had come back louder. A supervisor of records stood in the doorway, his badge clipped to a gray sweater, and checked the time on the wall before he checked the screen. His mouth pressed into a neat line, practiced and private. I did not speak yet. Speaking too early here is like stepping off a curb before the light changes. I let the room notice the smell of warm paper from the printer and the clear blue of the stamp. I let the clock say more than I could. I rested my fingers on the edge of the receipt the way you steady a fragile picture frame, a gesture my wife used when she cleaned the glass over our wedding photo. She would say, "Don't tug, just place it where it belongs." I watched the judge's pen make 3 small notes, and I watched his pen pause. My name sat there in the ink next to a number with a dash. The dash looked like a bridge I could walk if I could get the right sentence under my feet. The microphone crackled a small sound, and it reminded me of a radio in a kitchen long ago, when we turned the dial slow and waited for a voice to find us. The humiliation washed its second wave when the assistant, still staring at the screen, said the system showed no timely evidence. It was said soft, not to wound, but the words carried the weight of an official seal without the seal itself. A lawyer in a blue suit behind me exhaled like a punctured tire. The supervisor of records took one step into the room, then another, as if each step needed permission. I centered the receipt on the folder and lifted it so hands, not eyes, could do the talking. I knew what I would ask for: the rule in writing, the reconsideration, the rule aloud, the audit of the recording cue. I could feel Nathan's focus behind me, tight as a knot. The clock's second hand slapped its way forward. The air conditioner sent a cool ribbon of air across the back of my neck. Someone in the far row peeled open a peppermint, and the smell of sugar and menthol drifted like a memory of winter. The judge lifted his head. The pen hovered. The bailiff turned 1/4 of an inch and then stopped. The supervisor of records crossed his arms with the quiet of a man used to not being heard until the last minute. The woman at the clerk's window placed the red pen on the counter and slid a notepad closer, her fingertips barely touching it. The microphone made a small pop. I raised the stamped receipt until the time on it caught the courtroom lights and asked for immediate review under Section 4.2 as the judge leaned toward the microphone. The microphone took my request and carried it across the room like a paper boat. It drifted under the clock's tick, over the smell of lemon cleaner and warm toner, past the wooden rows where people settled their hands on their knees. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the docket assistant slid sideways to a second monitor. The bailiff adjusted his stance by 1/2 an inch, and the judge gave a small, economical nod that meant check it. The screen closest to me flickered into a search field. The assistant typed my case number with careful fingers and waited. The cursor blinked as if it were listening to a story it didn't want to hear. No result. The assistant tried again, slower, then added a suffix. Still nothing. My name formed on their lips without leaving their mouth. Behind the glass, the clerk's red pen lifted and hovered like a bird uncertain where to land. I kept the stamped receipt high enough to meet the room, not in defiance, but in proof that breathes. The ink was a deep blue that held its ground under the lights. The stamped circle rested over the printed words like a seal pressed into soft wax. I could feel the slight texture of it through the page, a small ridge where the rubber met the fibers. My hand remembered the counter where they pressed it down, the smudge of powdered paper, the quiet nod from the window when the number rolled out of the machine and became mine. Nathan rose from the bench and moved 2 steps closer, not crowding, just within reach if my knees misread the moment. He angled his phone so that the sentence I needed filled the screen, the one that allowed immediate reconsideration when the physical record proved timely and the electronic record lost its way. His thumb hovered over the brightness bar, raising it a notch when the overhead light buzzed and dimmed. His presence put a steady weight in the air, the way someone sets down a full pitcher so the table knows it won't tip. The assistant called for a supervisor. The request was quiet, meant for the front row, not the room, but rooms have ears. A man in a gray sweater with a laminated badge appeared in the doorway and took in our arrangement with a single sweep. My folder at the podium, the clerk behind glass, the assistant bent over the keyboard, the judge watching without watching. He moved toward a terminal that sat higher than the rest, the kind meant for reports rather than dockets, and logged in with a series of keystrokes that sounded like a combination lock.
He opened an audit panel. Columns stacked themselves on the screen. Timestamp, batch ID, queue status, user code. He filtered the day of my filing, then the hour, then the minute that lived on my receipt. The panel updated with a small chime, polite and tired. Rows appeared like rails, each line a piece of track laid down by some hand I would never shake. The supervisor leaned in, his forehead nearly touching the glass, and scrolled 1 notch at a time. Behind the clerk's window, the young woman with the lanyard frowned in the slow way of someone pulling a thread that might be attached to a much larger knot. She opened a drawer and removed a stack of thin paper sleeves, the kind that hold scanned originals until the shred bins come. I saw her mouth move around my last name, as if checking its shape. She looked toward the printer, then toward me, then toward the panel on the wall that listed the day's intake by lot. Humiliation doesn't always sting. Sometimes it spreads, thin and quiet, until you realize you've been made smaller by almost invisible measurements. The assistant kept their voice flat as they explained to the bench that the system didn't show timely evidence. A lawyer 3 rows back smacked his lips and checked his watch. The bailiff's eyes slid past me toward the door as if I were already on my way out. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth, and I tasted the sugar mint from the candy someone had opened earlier, a sweetness trying to cover something else. Nathan's hand rested, just for a second, at the edge of the podium. He didn't touch me. He touched the wood, and the wood touched the moment back. He nudged his phone closer. He had highlighted the clause that said the rule existed for days exactly like this. He looked at me the way my wife looked at me when she wanted me to see the thing that would keep me from losing my temper. I breathed slow, counting to the time on the stamp, and let the anger fold itself away like a well-creased letter. The supervisor's panel finally found my minute. There it was, one line among many, a batch entry with a Q note that didn't match the life of the paper in my hand. The line carried the right time and a batch ID that should have released into the docket within a short window. Instead, the status column showed a handoff delay, a technical phrase that sounded like a shrug in a suit. The supervisor scrolled again, then opened the line to expand its details. The screen reflected in his glasses, tiny blue numbers scrolling across the lenses like a river. The clerk pulled one sleeve from the stack and tapped the edge against the counter to square it. The thin plastic made a small drum sound. She slipped a page out and examined a stamp near the top, then another one near the bottom. She looked up at me and then back down, and her head tilted in the involuntary way of a person feeling their memory return with a little sting of embarrassment. She paged through the sleeve, then through another, then set both aside, as if to say the story was larger than one pocket. The assistant printed the current docket view. The printer exhaled a warm, slightly metallic scent, and the paper arrived with a whisper. The document listed cases like bones in a spine, each vertebra neat and numbered. Next to my line sat a blank where an attachment should have lived. I could see the shape of the absence as clearly as if someone had cut a square out of the page. The assistant placed the paper near my folder without quite touching it, as if the page might bruise. A slow accumulation of small dismissals pressed around me, the courtroom lights that hummed just a little too loudly, the door that sighed every time someone slipped in and out, the apologetic smiles that landed shy of the eyes. The judge's pen clicked open and closed, a metronome that wished the afternoon would play simpler. The bailiff repositioned his feet. The clock ticked high and unbothered, 1 second the same size as the next. It all mounted like rain on the brim of a hat. I needed one simple thing, the machine and the paper to admit the same minute. I could not make anyone care more. I could only make the proof visible enough that ignoring it would feel like a wrong note in a quiet room. I set the receipt flat on the folder and slid, beneath it, the copy of the local rule. I placed the 2 pages so their edges aligned, so the time would sit above the clause, like a key above a lock. In my head, I rehearsed the steps my wife used to recite. Show, connect, ask. Nathan murmured breath without words beside my shoulder. He scanned the margin with his thumb, ready to scroll if anyone asked to see the line. He had turned off notifications so the screen wouldn't flash with unrelated life. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm I borrowed when mine went uneven. He was young enough to believe rules could be followed, and old enough to know sometimes they needed to be pointed at from close range. The supervisor printed a log extract. The first page slid out, then a second, then a third. He shook them once to cool the ink and brought them forward. The paper clicked under his fingernails. He stopped halfway to the podium and angled the sheet so the assistant could see. The assistant leaned in.
Their shoulders nearly touched, but didn't. They both looked to the bench. The judge adjusted his glasses and didn't speak. For a moment, I was aware of everything at once. The cold seam where the podium's edge met my forearm, the faint smell of wool from the supervisor's sweater, the grain of the folder under my palm, soft from years of use, the heavy, regular breath of the air conditioner, and the peppermint settling on the tongue like a coin. I felt the quiet insistence of being in the right and the practical doubt of having to prove it where proof had already lived uncomplicated in my hands. I thought of the day at the clerk's counter, the number torn from the little machine, the sliding of my fee across the tray, and the smile of the woman behind glass that carried no sign of what would be lost in the wires. The stamp had been pressed on the page with a firmness, both kind and final. A record had been born. How could a birth certificate vanish in a hospital that was still standing? The question moved through me with an old ache. The clerk behind the glass straightened and pressed the intercom. Her finger hovered before it landed. She made a small signal to the supervisor, a shared language of offices and windows. He adjusted the printout in his hands, set his jaw in a line that wasn't unkind, and took the last 2 steps toward me. The assistant reached for a pen and paused. The judge's pen stopped clicking. The supervisor lifted the top page of the log so I could see the timestamp that matched the blue circle on my receipt, and in the same breath, the monitor at the front blinked to life with my case number. The monitor woke up with my case number and held it there like a breath. The supervisor angled the log so I could see the line with my exact minute, and I let the stamp receipt rest flat on my folder, then slid the log beneath it until the time on paper stared down the same time on the screen. I reached into the folder and pulled out the page with the local rule. The paper had the faint smell of public toner and public hands. I laid it beside the receipt so the clause sat where my eyes could find it without hunting. The 3 pages together looked like a small bridge I could walk if I kept my steps steady. Nathan moved to the aisle and stood where he could see both me and the supervisor. He had already taken photos of the receipt and the rule, one after the other, and named them clearly on his phone. I watched his thumbs work the file names into order. Receipt timestamp, audit log extract, local rule 4-2. His face was calm in the way young men get when they refuse to be pulled into someone else's hurry. The brightness from his screen cut a soft square on the wood and made the pencil underline on my rule page glow.
The docket assistant shifted their weight and placed a blank form on the podium, the kind with 2 lines at the top for case number and date. The paper had a top edge the color of old cream and a faint watermark down the center. They said something like "for the record," but the words were swallowed by the hum of the lights. I uncapped my pen and felt the cool click in my fingers. The ink smelled faintly of metal and waited for me to decide how firm my hand would be. I wrote the date, then the case number, then my name in the slow, careful letters I use when writing on government paper. The pen tip scraped a little where the pulpy sheet drank more ink. I titled the page, "Request for Reconsideration Limited to Recording Error under Local Rule 4.2, and kept the rest of my words spare. I wrote that the physical filing was timely, that the clerk's receipt bore the same minute as the log, that the electronic docket had failed to reflect that minute, and that the rule allowed immediate review. I kept my sentences short so they could not be bent later, and made sure the time on the receipt matched the time I wrote in the body of the request. As I wrote, another wave of small humiliations lapped at my ankles. The lawyer in the blue suit looked right through me to the clock, and then checked his phone under the bench like a boy in church. The bailiff's gaze skimmed over my folder in a way as if too long a look might suggest he doubted the bench. The clerk's window phone rang and rang before someone picked up, and whoever answered spoke in a voice too sweet to be for someone in trouble. The judge's pen clicked closed and then open again, and the sound clipped the end of sentences not meant for me. My hand shook once. a small tremor that made a tiny spike on the line of an F. I set the pen down and breathed through the way my wife taught me, feeling my ribs from the sides, counting in time with the second hand on the wall clock. Nathan's presence steadied the room. He stood quietly, a counterweight to the draft that moves through places where decisions are made. He straightened the strap of his backpack without looking down. He lifted his chin the smallest amount when the clerk looked our way, a gesture of respect that refused to shrink. The young woman behind the clerk's glass reappeared with a slim stack of emergency intake forms, the ones used when a record needed to be attached after the fact. She placed one on a small tray that slid through under the glass. The tray made a hollow sound, the sound of ice in an empty refrigerator. The form asked for the nature of the omission, the document type, the receipt number, and the staff initials responsible for the initial intake. I filled each box with the same careful hand, pausing over the word omission as if it could be replaced with a smaller word that would make the truth easier to swallow. The supervisor returned to the audit panel and highlighted the batch ID that had hesitated in the queue. He pointed to a column labeled status and then to another labeled handoff, and his finger rested on a tiny triangle that meant the line could be expanded. He expanded it and nodded once at what he found. The nod wasn't to me or the bench, it was to the numbers, to their clean agreement with the circle of ink on my page. He printed a second copy of the extract and placed it beside the first like a mirror for anyone who wasn't sure which face to believe. I stacked my pages in the order that made sense to me and would make sense to anyone watching with honest eyes. Cover sheet, request, copy of the receipt, copy of the log excerpt, copy of the local rule. I slid a paper clip over the left corner and felt the metal slip into place with a dry little snap. I kept the originals on my right, where my hand could find them without looking. My folder smelled like old paper, and the lemon cleaner the room wore like cologne. I loved it in the stubborn way you love a tool that has always returned your effort with service.
Nathan held out his phone again with the rule bright, and I let my eyes fall on the exact line I had quoted, reading it once more to make sure that the letters in my request followed the same path as the letters on the rule. He had bolded nothing, underlined nothing, just centered the clause on the screen so that anyone who glanced could not miss the shape of it. He whispered the number 4.2 under his breath, not a prompt, not pressure, just a quiet agreement that this was the hinge the door could swing on if someone would turn it. The assistant took my clipped packet and held it carefully, as if the pages might shift out of order if they were jostled. They asked the clerk for a stamp. The clerk slid a date stamp forward and pressed it in a small pad, then down on the top page, solid and square. The sound was silk on wood. The blue numbers rose against the cream with the calm of something that has been done correctly 1,000 times and will be done correctly 1,000 more. The assistant handed the packet to the supervisor, who initialed the top corner and noted a reference code that would travel with the reattachment. I watched their hands move, and in their movement I felt something I refused to name hope. But the room still held more ways to make a person small. A man in the back row raised his eyebrows at another, and both smiled the thin smile people carry when they think a story like mine is someone else's lesson. The door opened and shut, and the sigh of the hydraulics hinge felt like a quiet suggestion to give up now and save a chair. The judge looked at a different file and kept his tone even, as if smoothness were the same as fairness. The clerk slid a second tray outward with a slip marked routing. It listed the path my packet would take inside the office: intake desk, re-indexing queue, verification, docket update. I traced the words with my eyes the way my wife used to trace the quilting lines on a bedspread she was proud of. The route looked clean on paper,
The pot between the lines was where people lived, and that was where small errors grew into big setbacks if no one watched them breathe. Nathan's shoulder brushed the edge of my jacket as he stepped close enough for me to catch his scent, a mix of laundry soap and the vanilla lotion his mother insists on. He lowered his voice to the place only I could hear and told me the photos were backed up, the files named, the times recorded. He didn't say it like a boast. He said it like a rope, coiled and ready if the climb got steeper. I nodded and felt the coin in my pocket, thin and familiar, circle against my fingers. I handed over the packet and signed where the assistant pointed. The pen they offered was heavier than mine and left a darker line. It dug into the paper like a plow. I printed my name with the care of a man writing on a birth certificate. The assistant placed a small receipt on the podium, the kind with perforations along one side, and tore it clean. The scent of torn paper lifted, dry and papery sweet, and disappeared. I tucked the slip into the front of my folder, above the original receipt, a little echo of blue against blue. For a span of seconds, the room narrowed to the rectangle of wood in front of me, the clock tick, and the faint buzz of a fluorescent tube that needed replacing. I pressed the edge of the folder with my left hand and felt the soft give of worn cardboard. The supervisor held the packet like a waiter carries a plate that may spill, balanced and deliberate. The clerk returned her red pen to its perfect line next to the tape dispenser. The assistant straightened the other files, not for me, not against me, simply because this was the part of their day where stacking felt like control. The oppression collected in small sediments around my shoes, the way I had to curate proof of something the system itself had already recorded, the way my request was a plea for a process to honor its own steps, the way my age was noticed first and my facts last. I let the weight sit where it must and did not let it crawl up into my throat. My grandson's quiet steadiness pushed back against it like a wall.
The packet left the podium and crossed the room toward a side door with a frosted window. I watched it go because the watching was a form of ownership. I gathered my originals and squared them with the side of my hand. The folder closed with a soft clap. The bench creaked when I took a step back. The air conditioner sent an even breath across my collar. The clock's second hand slid from the 12 to the 1, and it was the slowest, loudest step I had heard all day. The assistant turned toward the bench with a subtle lift of the chin that asked for attention without stopping the world, and the judge shifted his pen to the left side of the legal pad and touched the microphone with one finger as a red light blinked on. If this is reaching you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and send it to a friend who cares. The red light on the microphone steadied, then held. The judge cleared his throat once and asked the front table to place my packet on the record for procedural review. His voice neither sped me forward nor pushed me back. It moved along a straight line that made room for steps I could count. The docket assistant lifted my pages so the camera at the corner could see the cover sheet, then the receipt, then the rule. The camera made a soft click each time a page paused, the sound of a cabinet closing gently. The supervisor returned to his terminal and brought up the re-indexing cue. A thin progress bar appeared, pale blue against gray, and crept forward one notch. He checked the box labeled verification by a physical stamp and typed the receipt number from my page with slow precision, lips shaping each digit as if giving the number a body might help it stand. He printed a one-page checklist for emergency attachment. The printer breathed warm air over our wrists. The paper smelled faintly of dust and glue. At the clerk's window, the young woman slid a tray out with a blank incident note. the kind that lives in a training binder after a day like this. She wrote the intake date, the time on my receipt, the batch ID from the log, and a short description. Attachment delayed in handoff, confirmed by a physical stamp within window. She underlined within window with a ruler laid along the line. Then she signed her initials and the hour. The red pen left a neat trail. The tip made a whisper over the paper, like a match struck and then gently blown out. Nathan stepped back to the row but kept his phone in his hand, screen dark now to save the image of the rule in place. He looked at me and gave the smallest nod, a reminder that nothing was floating loose. He had already saved the photos in a folder he named the way he names things that need to be found quickly. His backpack strap creaked when he shifted his shoulder. The sound pulled me back to my kitchen table, to the way my wife used to fix a loosened chair with a patience that made tools feel like friends. The judge asked whether the office had a written protocol for when a physical receipt conflicts with the electronic docket. The supervisor answered in the restrained language of departments and forms. There is guidance. There will be clearer guidance. This instance will inform and update. He did not apologize. He did not defend. He hovered in the narrow path between. He held the log extract up so the bench could see the timestamp, then laid it on the table flat, smoothing the corners with his palm until the page lay easy. The journalist at the back, a man I'd seen in small-town council meetings and school board nights, lifted his notebook. He did not scribble. He printed each line with care. The way he wrote made me think of cross-stitch patterns my wife taught our granddaughter. Slow, uniform, meant to be read after the thread is tied. He tapped his pen once against the paper and then stilled it. The tap and annotation only he would understand later.
The docket assistant opened a binder labeled local rules and slid a bright sticky flag onto the page with 4.2 at the top. The binder's rings clicked shut like a measured breath. He wrote a small note in the margin on a loose slip. Confirm audit trail consistency. Verify physical receipt authority. Route for immediate reconsideration per 4.2. He paperclipped the slip to the binder edge so it wouldn't disappear into the spine. He reached for a stamp that said received for review and pressed it onto a routing card with his full weight, but not force. The table took the pressure and gave it back as a steady thump. I let the small machinery of the room move without trying to push it. A few months ago, I might have rushed, spoken into the spaces where the process should speak. Age taught me that some gears grind when hurried, and some obey only when they can hear their own teeth meeting. The air conditioner exhaled over the room in even strokes. The lemon cleaner did its best to sweeten what couldn't be sweetened. The clock kept time without opinion. I felt the coin in my pocket slide along my palm as I shifted and imagined my wife saying, "Look, the parts are starting to see each other." The clerk retrieved my original receipt through the slot, compared the ink circle to a test stamp she pressed on scrap paper, and nodded at the saturation and edge. She held both to the light and rocked them to see the sheen. The red pen marked a tiny check next to physical match observed. She returned my original through the slot with 2 fingers and added a transparent sleeve for it, a quiet sign of respect for paper that had done its work and would need to keep it. Nathan leaned forward and asked softly if I wanted him to email the photos to myself as a second backup. The question had no rush in it. He was offering a belt to go with the suspenders already on. I told him yes with a glance, and he tapped his phone 3 times, then rested it face down on his knee. He does not boast about caution. He treats it like a habit to hand down, as one might pass along a recipe card with smudged edges and a note in the corner. Don't skip the resting time. The supervisor wrote a short draft on a half sheet titled Action Items from Intake Incident.
The bullet points were plain. Reinforce manual cross-check when receipt present. Establish automatic alert for handoff delays beyond threshold. Create simple desk card with 4.2 language. He placed the sheet near the clerk's window and said he'd formalize it later. The clerk nodded with the fatigue of someone who has seen fixes promised and half made. But there was something in her nod that told me the page would not be forgotten in a drawer. The judge asked if the packet had been marked for internal routing. The assistant held up the routing card with "Received for review," then slid it onto the top of my pages and placed both on a cart with a shallow lip. The wheels rolled half a turn and stopped with a rubber squeak. The cart smelled faintly of oil and old cardboard. I noticed a neck on its edge that looked like a small crescent moon. The assistant's hand rested there for a second, thumb tapping once in thought, then lifted away. I kept my own original square and ready. The folder warmed under my hand, heat collected from my skin in the light above. The grain of the cardboard felt familiar as a linen shirt that has been washed enough to soften, but not thin. I could feel the curve of the paperclip and the clean cut of each page as my fingertips lined them up. It mattered to me that the first thing I would see when I opened it again would be the stamp, and then the rule, and then the request. A story commits better when told the same way each time. The bailiff shifted his feet and let them find a stance that promised quiet. He scanned the room out of habit. His eyes did not land on me as a problem. They passed over me like a patrol on a calm shore. It reminded me that not every figure in a uniform needed to be an obstacle in my mind. Some were furniture of the institution, sturdy, neutral, taking weight without commentary. Seeing that eased something in my shoulders I hadn't realized had lifted.
The journalist closed his notebook. He didn't tuck it away, just placed it across his lap, palm on top, as if holding place for another line. He met my eyes with the look people use when they have watched long enough to recognize work. He didn't smile, he didn't frown. He gave me the decency of no performance. That small decency tightened the knot that held me to my own restraint. The supervisor returned to the progress bar. It had moved another notch. He signed a small box on his checklist and time-stamped the line. The stamp thunked softly. The ink bled into the paper in a straight-edge rectangle. He stepped aside so the assistant could initial below his mark. Their initials sat like two anchors at the bottom of a page. I breathed in slow and felt the cool, dry air coat my throat. I tasted a trace of peppermint left in the room. I listened to a chair in the back settle under someone's shifting weight, to the paper-soft sounds of a suit sleeve against a desk, to the quick scratch of a pen somewhere to my left where a lawyer corrected their own draft. None of it concerned me. All of it carried me. The judge looked down at his legal pad and drew a single line under my case number. He set his pen to the side. The red light on the microphone blinked once and then held steady again. The assistant gave the smallest gesture to indicate the packet had entered the path it needed to enter. The clerk's red pen clicked closed. The supervisor placed his checklist face up on the table, neat, completed in the sections that could be completed now, open where only time and another page would answer. I closed my folder and rested both hands on it. The cardboard was warm from my palms. Nathan settled into the bench with his phone quiet and his eyes on me. I stood still and let the room's order return to itself. The running lines had been tied, the loose threads had been gathered, the work that belonged to paper had been given to paper, and the work that belonged to waiting had found me where I stood. The judge lifted his hand, and the red light on the microphone steadied like a small sun. He spoke in the same measured tone as before, but now the air seemed tuned to it. He stated my case number, the time on the physical receipt, and the time on the audit log, one after the other, clean as stepping stones across shallow water. He described the handoff delay and the policy that lives in the book with a bright flag at 4.2.
He said the words for the record, and the room gave them back with the soft echo of wood and cloth and the hush of people who know the line has finally been found. He instructed the clerk's office to attach my receipt and log extract to the docket immediately. He directed that the prior dismissal for lack of evidence be set aside and that the matter return to the track it should have been on from the start. He asked the supervisor to prepare a short memorandum for training focused on manual cross-checks when a physical stamp is present and to draft a desk card quoting the exact clause that allowed reconsideration when the electronic record falls behind the truth. He wanted a copy placed at the intake window and another at the front table. He asked that a brief note be added to the public terminal advising filers to retain stamped receipts and, if necessary, request review under the rule we had just used. None of it came with heat. It came with direction. The docket assistant nodded and reached for a rubber stamp that said vacated. The stamp kissed the page with a crisp thump. The ink framed the word in a neat rectangle that settled into the fibers. The supervisor marked the checklist again and slid my packet to the cart with a motion that was almost careful enough to be called respectful. The clerk pressed 2 keys, then a third, and the monitor refreshed. Where there had been a blank square beside my case number, a tiny paperclip icon appeared gray against gray, and the file name, receipt_timestamp, stepped into the light.
I didn't move. It felt important to let the paper move first. My folder was warm beneath my hands, and the grain of the old cardboard felt like a familiar voice in a room that had not always bothered to listen. I heard the air conditioner breathe, even and cool, and the clock ticked forward without drama. Lemon cleaner hung around the edges. The printer rolled out another page, a docket update, and the sound of it was a clean sheet pulled over a made bed. Nathan was a steady presence at my shoulder. He watched the paperclip icon appear with the focus of someone checking a pulse, then let out a breath I hadn't noticed he was holding. He had already finished the email to me with the photos and file names and times. He locked his phone and tucked it into his pocket, but he kept his hand on the bench as if the wood were a promise you could lean on. His calm and youth filled a space the years had hollowed in me, not by being loud, but by being exact. The judge asked whether any further immediate steps were needed to make the record whole. The supervisor said no, that the attachment and the internal note would travel together, and that the docket would reflect both within the hour. He said he would log similar handoff delays from the last month and circulate the count to the bench and the intake staff. The clerk added that a small sign could be posted by afternoon, plain language, no legal jargon, so that anyone standing at the glass could see it and know what to ask for if the wires lost their grip on their paper. He didn't apologize, the judge. He didn't have to. The orders were the apology. The weight came off my ribs the way a winter coat comes off when the sun finally clears a side street. I loosened my fingers on the folder and felt the coin in my pocket tilt and settle. I thought of my wife, of the way she traced seams with her thumb before she stitched them, and I let my breath follow that motion, small and sure. The bailiff took a single step back to where he had stood at the start, neutral again, his hands resting at the belt clasp. The move told me the room had returned to its ordinary weather, but something had been set in it, like a fence post, tamped until it won't lean. The journalist at the rear wrote one last line, lifted the paper to the corner light, and read it to himself with his lips. He closed the notebook without triumph and without disappointment, the way one closes a door that now fits its frame. The clerk's windows slid open with a soft rattle, and the young woman returned my transparent sleeve.
She had added a small tab at the top with my case number handwritten in neat blue. The kind of small gesture that means you expect to find the right thing quickly the next time you reach for it. I placed the sleeve into my folder and pressed the edges even with my palm. The paper inside made a faint rustle, a sound like grass when the wind changes direction. The judge made one last notation on his pad, a single line under my case number and a small mark beside the rule citation. He asked the assistant to ensure the audio captured the order clearly. The red light on the microphone shone steady, and I could almost feel the hum of the recording equipment gathering the words and laying them down in order. My name, the minute on the stamp, the minute in the log, the rule, the action. It was as if the machine itself understood that this is how records should be made, by letting truth in the room and giving it a seat. He concluded the procedural portion and returned to the docket. His tone did not change. He moved to the next case with the same even carriage, but the people at the front table had already begun to do what he had directed. The assistant slid the training draft toward the supervisor. The clerk opened a blank document for the desk card and typed the first sentence. When a stamped receipt shows timely filing and the docket does not, request immediate review under Local Rule 4.2. The sentence landed without ornament, which is how instructions take root.
I stood there a few seconds longer, letting the new shape of the air settle into me. The subplots that had tugged at the edges, whether anyone would see the stamp, whether the log would match, whether the room would give the rule a mouth, were no longer loose. They had been tied with short knots. The consequences were not fireworks. They were checklists and small signs and a paper clip on the screen. They were training lines and a memorandum and a stamped word that canceled another word. They were enough. Nathan touched the sleeve of my jacket, a small pressure that said, "It is done for now," in the way things are done in places like this. His eyes were bright, but now wet. He had watched the whole sequence with a patience I recognized from an earlier version of myself, a man who once lifted beams and waited while the level found center. The smell of toner had thinned, and the room had taken on the cotton smell of paper that has been handled and put where it belongs. The judge did not look up again as we gathered our things. He didn't need to. The orders had spoken. The assistant, in a rare glance, met my eyes with a brief acknowledgement, not friendship, not apology, just recognition. The supervisor gave the narrowest nod, the kind you give to a number when it finally lines up and you can go on to the next column. The clerk returned to a stack with a posture that looked less tired than before. I slid the folder under my arm and felt its weight change, not lighter, just right. The benchwood was smooth under my palm as I turned, and the polished floor reflected a dim stripe of light from the high windows. The clock ticked. The door sighed and let a draft across the aisle. My shoes found the seam where tile met carpet and followed it like a trail back to the world outside the glass and microphones. We stepped into the hall where the air was cooler and smelled faintly of stone. Nathan fell in the step beside me. We didn't need to speak. Somewhere behind us, the printer would still be working. The desk CAD would be forming. The memo would be getting its bullet points in order. Those were not my rooms to tend anymore. I had placed my papers where they needed to be and watched them take root. At the threshold, I paused because I wanted to hold the picture of the chamber as it had been in that last minute. The paperclip icon alive on the screen, the stamp square on the page, the binder closed on the rule with the bright flag peeking out, the red light steady, the cart still, the people doing their small, exact parts. It was a simple picture. It was enough to live on for the rest of the day. I tightened my grip on the folder and felt the coin in my pocket pressed back against my palm. My wife would have approved of this kind of ending, quiet and thorough. She would have said that a clean ledger is a kind of prayer. She would have liked the way the rule was treated as furniture, not as decoration. She would have approved of the little sign. I walked forward with my grandson beside me, down a hall that did not tilt. The world did not change under my feet. My name did not become larger or smaller. It simply sat where the record said it should sit, which was all I had come to ask for. When the doors opened, the outside air moved across my face and smelled like rain, even though the sky was clear. When truth finds the record, a man can stand still and be seen. Let the proof speak, and the room will listen. If you valued this story, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would do in my place. Until the next story.